Well, what about the 14th and 15th Amendment? Well, surely they had an effect after Reconstruction. Well, not necessarily. And that's because of disenfranchisement, which means taking away the right to vote. Remember, the right to vote was seen for African Americans as the only real means for improvement. Elect people that are going to help them and continue to elect those people that help them. Well, African Americans were threatened if they voted Republican that they might lose their jobs, they might be evicted from their homes, or they might even be beaten, tortured, or killed. We'll talk more about violence in a moment. Fraud was also used to disenfranchise African Americans. Remember, Democrats end up controlling the voting process in many of the areas of the South. And as a result, they are stuffing the ballot box with extra Democratic votes. They are discarding African American votes. There is false voting going on. There was a lot of corruption during Reconstruction and the time after, on both for both political parties. But African Americans really lost out when Democrats disenfranchised them with fraud at the polling place. More formal legal methods are used to disenfranchise African Americans as well. One means was a poll tax, and that's where you had to pay a fee to be able to vote. Many African Americans living in poverty, working as sharecroppers, would make the decision that it just wasn't worth the money to vote. Other states had residency requirements where a voter had to show where they lived and prove where they lived. This is especially hard for sharecroppers because you're living on someone else's land. And other states used literacy tests, which required voters to prove their ability to read and write before being allowed to vote. Now, you might be thinking that these three things would disenfranchise poor whites as well, and they would, and sometimes they did, except for when states passed what were called grandfather clauses, and these were eventually used all over the South. But what this did was allowed anyone with a relative who had voted in the election of, say, 1860, from before African Americans were given the right to vote, anybody who had a relative who voted in the election of 1860 was allowed to vote without passing a literacy test, or without proving residency, or without even having to pay a poll tax. The most troubling means of disenfranchising African Americans and limiting the effectiveness of the 14th and 15th Amendment was the violence used against them. And lynching is the most disturbing violence used against African Americans. From 1889 to 1899, there were an average of 187 lynchings in the United States a year. And the vast majority of those are African Americans lynched in the South. And it's important to clarify that these are not people who were executed. These are not people who are put on trial and found guilty and convicted. These are people who were just murdered by an angry mob. Lynchings were just one of the strategies of violence and intimidation used by groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League and other organizations throughout the South. Now, these groups spring up in response to the Union League's efforts to recruit Republican votes. The White League and the KKK used violence and intimidation to scare African Americans and white Republicans into not voting. And they were very effective in some areas. In some areas, they have huge numbers of people joining their secret organizations. And as a result, President Grant tries to stem the violence by getting Congress to pass the Enforcement Acts in 1870 and 1871. These created penalties for interfering with the right to vote. They put federal election supervisors and marshals in charge of congressional elections. And they even allowed the president to suspend habeas corpus to detain suspected Klan members. However, President Grant finds it hard to consistently enforce the Enforcement Acts, and there really is unrelenting resistance from those Southern racists. And as a result, even the Enforcement Acts are pretty ineffective at curtailing the white supremacist violence. If you looked at black prisoners, you might even think that the 13th Amendment was never ratified. Black prisoners in the South were rented out to do work. Mine owners or logging companies rented African Americans for the very dangerous and sometimes deadly jobs. Or African Americans worked on chain gangs. This was just like slave labor. They're often working in fields owned by the state governments. They worked hours similar to slaves. They could be whipped like slaves. Some were even shot for the just even looking like they might be trying to flee. Some people even think this might have been worse than slaves because the wardens had no financial incentive to take it easy in the slightest bit on black prisoners. Why isn't anybody in the North doing anything about this? Well, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act in 1875, and what this did was call for equality in public accommodations. Hotels, transportation, theaters, these had to be equal. Well, the Supreme Court in a number of cases near the end of the 1800s weakens this new law with a lot of decisions that go against African Americans. And the Supreme Court weakens the 14th and 15th Amendment with other decisions that really limit the effectiveness of those amendments. And the most important case of the era was the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, in which the Supreme Court said that separate but equal was okay. Well, why isn't anybody in the general public doing anything about this? Well, remember, the Civil War began in 1860. It lasted all the way until 1865. We're now spreading west, which means that we're coming into contact and more conflict with Native Americans. And there are new economic opportunities opening up to Americans and a vigorous debate nationwide over currency and the tariff. All of these things become more important to white Northerners than civil rights for African Americans. So although the 14th and 15th Amendments will have major effects in the 20th century, in the 19th century, their effects are really, really limited.